Welcome back. This is part 3 of our series AngularJS and SharePoint. In this section, we're going to dive into the components that make up our application. We're going to return to our website. As you saw previously, we have a SharePoint list we created, IT requests, and now we're going to use AngularJS to increase the capabilities of that list. We're going to store our JS files and HTML files in the Site Assets library. We're going to create a site page in the Site Pages collection, and that is going to be the place where we host our application. And we're going to put a content editor web part on that site page, and then we're going to point to our home page for our application. As you can see in the diagram, spsdemo.aspx will be our site page. Request.html is the home page in the Site Assets library of our application, and then the 3 child pages, list, display, and edit, will be loaded inside of requests, making ours a single page application. We're also going to use a Fragment Identifier to move between the different pages. Here we are in the Site Assets library in SharePoint Designer, and you notice we're in the Requests folder. All of the files you see listed here are necessary for this application. Some of them are JavaScript libraries. These relate to Angular. These relate to jQuery. And these down here that start with UI grid are all part of the CSS files to make the UI grid work correctly. All of those files in a larger scale operation would probably go in a scripts library inside of Site Assets, or somewhere on the SharePoint Hive where you can access them from any of your site collections. But in order to make this demo as easy to understand as possible, and for the people at SharePoint Saturday to download and test, I put all of the files in one folder, in the Requests folder, so you can get up and running. But I would recommend that you take all of those files that are not related to the actual application, the ones that are the common files, and move them to the scripts library, just so you can have multiple applications sharing the same files and you don't have to reproduce them in every single application's folder. We're going to go ahead and right-click on requests.html, and as you can see, we have copy here. We're going to go ahead and click copy, and then we're going to move to our website. Okay, here's our website. I'll go up here and I'll show you the URL is spsdemo.aspx. That is a SharePoint page I already created. And we're going to go ahead and go here. We're going to add a web part. A content editor web part. And we're going to go ahead and go into the edit web part properties. Let me do this zooming in. Okay, good. Okay, so now if you're used to working with content editor web parts and you've done some CSS and jQuery, you can actually enter the content inside of the content editor web part. The trouble is, of course, if you make any changes or if you make a mistake, you sometimes end up having to go into the content manager page and just delete the entire web part because you can't undo the JavaScript. Say, for example, you have a loop that's printing out alerts endlessly. It's really not a good idea if you're doing anything at all involved, more than a couple of lines, to actually store the content in the content editor web part. It's much safer to link to a text file. So we're going to go ahead here and click paste. Now remember, we hit copy inside of SharePoint Designer. That actually gives us the whole link to our request.html page, which is the page we want to reference. So it's pretty neat. Now, you may have thought when we were in SharePoint Designer, if you right-click on a file and you click copy and you go to another folder in SharePoint Designer, yes, you can hit paste and that copies the file itself. But if you go to anything that's a text editor, copy stores the URL of that file as a string that you can then paste as we did here. So that saves us trying to get a copy of the URL. We just simply go copy. It's a neat little trick. Okay, under appearance, we're going to go ahead and call this IT requests, which is the name of our application. And we're going to set the Chrome type to none. Go ahead and hit apply. Now you'll notice that we have the title IT requests in the title bar here. And over here, we have this checkbox and this drop-down arrow. All of that is the title bar that SharePoint puts for every web part. And it's useful when you're editing to see that on the page if you want to have the users click the link, say, to go back to the SharePoint list or something. But in our case, we don't want to show that at all. So you notice we set the Chrome to none. So when the page loads, notice the title bar is not there. And here we have our application. As you can see, IT request, we have a title, we have a search, a view, a new request button. So here's our application. And it's already been populated in the background inside of our content editor web part. So from this point, we are not going to have to edit this page, this SPS demo ASPX page again. Now, if you were building an application and you wanted to show just the application and none of the SharePoint stuff around it, you can certainly do that. You know, I happen to want to show the menu and whatever else is of my SharePoint site, and this web part is meant to be an integral part of the site. If you wanted to have multiple AngularJS applications for multiple lists in your site all next to each other, you can do that as well. So for this example, I'm showing you how to build an application that embeds within a SharePoint site and looks like it's part of the overall site. But there are other ways you can design it. So if you were going to add another web part on this page, maybe a SharePoint list, maybe another custom web part, you can do that and they'd operate completely independently. But the point is, as of right now, anything else I do for my application, I never have to come back to the SPS demo page and make any changes. Once I've assigned the content editor web part to my home page, everything else we do, we're doing within our application. So as I've mentioned before, we are building a single page application. And you may be wondering at this point, well, what exactly does that mean? Well, as you can see from our diagram here, the list, display, and edit HTML files are all child pages, and they're going to appear inside of the parent page or the home page request.html. Our application is going to allow us to move from one page to another seamlessly to the user. You'll notice as we look at our application, this is the home page, but it is also the list page. You see we have a search, we have a view drop down, we have a new request button, and we have the items in our IT request list. If we look at one item, this is the view page. We look at the edit page. We go back to the view page. We go back to the list page. Something you notice is it does not flicker as it moves between child pages. And that is because of something called a fragment identifier. Now, back in the early days of HTML, when I guess people thought they paid so much money per page, you had entire books, entire owner's manuals put on a single HTML page. It was loaded once from the server, and you had links inside of your page, but they weren't links to other pages. They were links to other locations in the same page. So you had chapter 1, chapter 2, top, and so on. You still see some of those pages around. But the way that you made those work is you would put an anchor tag for chapter 1 at that location in your HTML. And then the link would have the name of your page and the pound or the hashtag symbol and the name of the anchor, chapter 1, and so forth. This is a fragment identifier, that pound symbol, that is a link that tells the browser, don't go to another page, stay on this page, but go to this specific location. Now, the interesting thing about AngularJS is it allows you to intercept that fragment identifier when it appears as a direction. You notice that our home page, the list had links to the display page, what I call the view page, or it's the display page for the list item. That was a link, and that link had a hashtag that told it what page it needed to load next. So AngularJS is able to intercept a link that has a fragment identifier. And using something called a routing class, we're able to actually build what we call a single page application, where we use fragment identifiers in our links to go back and forth between different child pages, and the router decides by reading the URL what page we're going to and what controller we're loading for that page. So I'm going to demonstrate to you what that fragment identifier looks like in operation. As you see here, we are currently on spsdemo.aspx. If I click on a link and I load the display page, you notice we now have display 1 and undefined. Undefined is our search. So if we go back to the home page and we type in, say, DIF, this is our search, and it filters our requests, but diff is our search criteria. We're preserving that and passing it from one page to the next. So let's click on display again, and you can see we have display, for, and diff. We still have spsdemo.aspx. We have the hashtag, which is telling Angular, okay, I'm using a fragment identifier. I want your router to grab this. We have display. We have the number 4, which is the list item ID. And we have diff, which is our search criteria. Now, if we go to the edit page, you can see it's edit for diff. We hit cancel. We're back to the display page, display for diff. And then we hit close, and we go back to our main list page, and we're back to just spsdemo.aspx, #/ and again, our search criteria, diff. Also notice that we still have diff loaded as our search. Our final slide for part 1 of my presentation is the AngularJS components that we're creating. This is what makes our application work. You saw them briefly in the Site Assets library in SharePoint Designer. Here I'm going to walk through each one of them and explain to you what they are. Now, in hour 2 of my presentation at SharePoint Saturday, I'm going to dive into each of these pages and show in detail what they contain and how the code works. But because I needed to break it up into 2 one-hour segments, I had to have some kind of conclusion to the first hour for the people who only wanted to attend one session. So they don't get to see in detail the code. But now you, because you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to have a chance to go watch part 2 when you're done and get to see everything that was available at the presentation. So here we have all of our lists. You notice that we have some HTML files and we have some JS files. So starting with request.html, that is our home page for the application. This is where I put all of the references to my JavaScript libraries and to every JS file you see listed here. Now, if you're used to working with JavaScript, you might say you have 5 HTML pages and 5 JavaScript pages in your website. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.html, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.js. And I know you're not going to call them that, but just for the sake of example, 1.js supports 1.html. So you have to reference 1.js in 1.html. 2.js supports 2.html, and so on. So each HTML page lists the one JS page that you are pulling JavaScript from. With Angular, when you're building a single page application like this, you only need to identify your JavaScript files in the top level page. So request.html is going to have my JS references, and all of my child forms are not going to have to reference anything. Request.js is the home page, the home JavaScript page or home code page. That is where my module, which is how Angular defines applications, that's where my module is defined, and that is where all components that are not a controller are defined. A controller is your primary class you work with in Angular. The controller is where you manipulate the data that gets displayed on the HTML page. In my case, I'm building a controller for the list and a controller for the item. So the list controller is responsible for anything that involves a SharePoint list, the search, the filter, and so forth. The item controller is for anything that pertains to one list item, how it's viewed, how it's displayed, how it's saved back to the server, how it's read from the server, and so on. Everything else, services and factories and directives and the router class that I mentioned, all of those live within request.js. So that file is basically everything that's not a controller is stored there. Now, I'll say here, if you chose, you could have one JS file that held everything for your application, and that's perfectly acceptable. But I found it much more convenient for editing purposes to separate out into distinct JS files different functionality. Next, we have our 3 child forms, list, display, and edit, you see there. Those are HTML files that are basically either a table or a div. They show the different pages or stages of our application. They don't have body tags, they don't have HTML tags, because these are all fragments of HTML embedded inside larger HTML files. So like I said, they're all going to have a table tag framing them. So list, display, and edit are our 3 child forms that get swapped in and out, and they all reside inside of request.html when displayed. Then we have request.list.js, which is where we store the list controller. And finally, request.items.js, which is where we store the item controller. So there we have it. We have 7 HTML and JS files. There's also a CSS file that I didn't bother to list. It's in there as well. But that's all we need to build our application. Okay, so this wraps up part one of my presentation, AngularJS and SharePoint. As you can see from my question slide, I've got my email and my web address here. There is the download is the name of the zip file that's found on the homepage of my website. You can find all of the files that I used within this demo are available there. And of course, YouTube, you already know because you're watching this on YouTube, but at SharePoint Saturday, I'm going to be listing my link to the YouTube videos so people can go home and watch them as you've already done. So I appreciate you sitting through my videos here. I hope you learned something, and please hit the subscribe button and support me. I'm trying to grow my YouTube presence. I'm kind of new to YouTube, and I'm really enjoying making these videos to talk about SharePoint and other things that I find interesting to me. So please hit subscribe and show your support. Thank you, and see you in part 2.